are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai, your host and White House correspondent, joining you live in afternoon drive time. I'm in touch, and so you be in touch. Be sure to follow me on all the social media platforms at Dr. Nii-Quartelai. Just type in Dr. Nii-Q, DRNIIQ. And there I am, fresh for you to follow. Also, be sure to download the KBLA app if you haven't already. Download the app. That way you can listen to us live or on demand, or just take us with you everywhere you go, because I know you have places to be this summertime. Last but not least, be sure to subscribe to A More Perfect Union podcast, where you can go for some of our most memorable conversations. All right. Now, listen. It's been a very busy news day, such a busy news day that even up until 5 minutes before we went live, we were still rearranging the show, because that's what we do here. We want to make sure that we capture the news that you really need to hold. We want to make sure that we're also talking with leaders on the front lines that know what time it is and know what's important to our community. And so in that spirit, I want to welcome Ashley Etienne. She's a veteran communication strategist who's advised President Obama and President Biden, as well as Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi. She's CEO of her own firm, Etienne and Saint, and she's a contributor to NBC's Meet the Press. Ashley, always a pleasure to have you with us on A More Perfect Union.
Same. Great to see you. And thanks for having me on the show. And look at us in our little button-up shirts. Don't we look cute?
You know, we always find a way to coordinate in spirit. I love it.
Exactly. Yes. Love that about you. Great to be on your show.
Well, great to have you. I want to start with a story first that's close to home. California voters are going to decide on 14 statewide ballot measures this November, everything from a billionaire's tax to an $11 billion affordable housing bond, voter ID requirements, the new rules for what happens after a governor's recall. It's a genuinely consequential ballot, and I think a lot of Californians don't even know it's coming yet. Ashley, from your vantage point, advising on messaging at the highest levels, how does a state like California, and frankly, a party nationally, actually communicate something this dense to working people who are just trying to get through their work week?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. I mean, most of these ballot initiatives have a separate set aside budget. You know, there's usually some organization behind each one of them that funds outreach to voters, messaging to voters, you know, the whole sort of campaign apparatus to voters. So it's really, for the most part, sort of a very decentralized effort. It's not a top-down effort. So many of these ballot initiatives aren't driven by the Democratic Party. And so it's hard for them to have any influence or control over it. It's mostly sort of a ground up and these outside organizations that are pushing these different initiatives. So those outside organizations pump upwards of, $100 million to some extent on these ballot initiatives, educating voters, turning out voters, ads and all these other sorts of things. But I think you're making a much larger point here, which is that the Democratic Party at the state level and at the federal level have to do more education. That is really the biggest gulf, in my opinion, the biggest gap that we're seeing right now is we're asking voters to vote on a lot. We're asking them to vote very frequently. I was just down in Houston. I think they voted 8 times in the last year. I mean, they're overwhelmed with voting. And so, so there has to be a commitment and more investment from the party top down to voters to educate voters on not just ballot initiatives, why they matter, why you should vote, but also the whole process at large. Like, what is a ballot initiative? Why does it matter to me? Where should I be voting and how should I be voting? Because some of these ballot initiatives, you and I have been in the actual voting booth, and you look at the language and they're so complicated that even I'm like, well, which way do I go? Like, how do I vote on this? So anyway, I think there has to be, and there's an acknowledgement at the national level and even at the state level that there needs to be more education, that we're exhausting voters and we're overwhelming them in a lot of respects.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to build on that. I think part of the challenge is that you have state legislatures that are gun shy to move on certain types of legislation. And so they're letting the voters decide, right?
Yes.
And look, there's nothing wrong with letting voters decide, but I think there's a point by which legislators are sort of abdicating, their
Oh,
role, right? They're sort of preserving their political capital and punting to voters. And so I think that's a challenge. But in addition, I really think that when it comes to these ballot initiatives, the education has to be throughout the year. It's got to be in between election cycles. It can't just be, the 8 to 12 weeks leading up to election day. And then, you're surprised that, voter turnout, isn't as high as it could be. And quite frankly, the election perhaps is even more expensive, right? Because you're having to do a whole lot more in a very short period of time. And so, what are the odds that we can actually begin to change the culture around voting and elections and ballot initiatives in our lifetime?
well, I mean, I think you raise a really profound point that I think is too often ignored, which is sort of the lack of courage on the part of the legislators to actually take on these issues during the state legislative sessions, and are, to your point, punting it to voters. Now, I will argue that I think that's an excellent point, but in some respects, on some of these ballot initiatives, you wanted to go through voters because you can then say, stand on stronger, firmer ground, saying it's the actual will of the voters, not the will of the body or the institution itself. So some of them, are more powerful statements coming from voters than if they pass through the legislature. And the reality is sometimes you can't even get it through the legislature. It might be better to get it through the voters, and California might be an exception in this. I don't know much about California state legislature, but California might be an exception in this regard. But there are some legislatures that are so tight that you couldn't even pass some of these ballot initiatives through that body. So it's better to send it to the actual voters. And then I also think about like national issues, like when I was doing a lot of gay marriage work. I mean, you definitely didn't want that to go through the individual states. I mean, you want a top down kind of approach. And so I think those two are excellent points. But I would also add to your question about sort of the in-between time. I'm a strategist, and the most important points are the in-between time. It's not, 30, 60, 90 days out from election.
Right.
It is how we're engaging voters between each one of those elections. And I know we're going to get into my op-ed about the resources, but that requires investment. It requires intentionality. It requires, in my opinion, a commitment to voters that we're seeing sort of wane at the national level, that we're seeing in a lot of cases that the money's being diverted to, and you made this point earlier when you were posing the question. I mean, money is a big deal. So if you've got 10 ballot initiatives, every one of them costs you $100 million, then that's money diverted away from winning some of these really tight elections. But there has to be some intentionality and money invested in education, and it requires a lot. I mean, but it requires a fundamental, to your point, change in how we do elections. Now, I don't know when that will change, but I am definitely committed to being a part of pushing the Democratic Party to rethink how it's actually campaigning, rethink who is an actual priority, and then rethink where they're making their investments and which communities that they're investing in.
Ashley, speaking of rethinking, just right before we went on air, a lot of news being made in Maine. The state's Democratic Party leadership is now formally calling on Graham Platner to drop out of the Senate race following that Politico report that we discussed in hour one of the show. Ashley, you've sat in rooms where parties have had to make brutal, fast decisions about candidates in crisis. What's the political calculus happening inside the Maine Democratic Party right now? And what does it say about how or whether the party's policies, what does it say about the party's policies themselves?
Well, I mean, I was just on the phone with folks in Maine, Democrats in Maine, and I was on the phone with the DSCC just recently, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign. And they issued a statement after the Maine Democrats did really double down in echoing what they said, but they also went a step further to say, we're not going to invest any money in the state until he drops out, which I thought was a really powerful statement from the from that campaign committee. What I'm hearing from folks on the ground is they just thought that, it's at this stage, it's too much baggage and it's too heavy. In addition to that, they just think that these allegations are disturbing and they want really a candidate who's beyond reproach. I mean, I wasn't for Platner from the beginning. I mean, when I found out and read that he had a Nazi tattoo, for me, that should have been eliminating enough. I'm not sure how how we overlooked that, or as a party sort of, found that to not be grounds for not supporting him or asking him to step out. I mean, so much of our politics have transformed over the last, I would say, since Trump showed up. So in the last 10 or so years, and I think in the last 2 years, we've become so desperate that, a candidate with a Nazi tattoo is somehow still acceptable to the Democratic Party. I mean, I found that to be incredibly disgusting, but I think they're taking the right move. And I think the point is at this stage, it's just too much baggage, and they still have an opportunity. I think it's until the 27th of June or July that the local party is it 27th or 23rd? 27th, that the local party has an opportunity to advance another candidate. So I think given that they still had room and time to advance another candidate, I think the calculus is like we got to dump this guy immediately so that we can get on to the next candidate and try to win this race. But people are very anxious about where this is going to head because, it's so late in the cycle, late in the game. How do you find somebody? I'm hearing that they may have to have a state convention or a party convention to sort of nominate somebody. That's one of the options that they're thinking through. That seems incredibly complicated and could be a nasty process. So as much as they can, sort of stop the bleeding is what folks on the ground in Maine and nationally are trying to figure out.
Well, speaking of stop the bleeding, there are a lot of folks who are absolutely underwhelmed by the Democratic Party and the vision and lack thereof it's casting.
Add me to the
list. Well, when we come forward, we're going to be talking about a pretty spicy op-ed, in essence, written by Ashley Etienne. We're going to unpack all of that and more. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai and really delighted to be in conversation with NBC News Meet the Press contributor and communication strategist Ashley Etienne. Ashley, you are the author of an op-ed, a spicy op-ed in essence that it has the streets buzzing. I want to spend some real time on this piece that is making its rounds right now. Your op-ed called The Party We Built, The Bill Has Come Due. Now, for those who haven't read it yet, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Walk our listeners through the core argument. What bill exactly is coming due?
Well, there was a lot of, and I'm sure you covered this on your show, there was a lot of talk about the Democrats releasing, I know you covered it on your show, there was a lot of talk about the Democrats releasing their autopsy of the 2024 race. So just a few weeks ago, they actually released the document, or what they called a draft of the autopsy. And what was in it is proof of what I've witness and experience being on the inside, and what I think a lot of voters today have speculated is the case, and that is the Democratic Party has consistently divested in Black communities. They have consistently, I think a more common way of saying it would be to take Black voters for granted, and have not prioritized investing in Black voters. So what I walk readers through is the finding in the autopsy that the Democratic Party, what I try to sort of educate folks on is that the Democratic Party is not just a political party. It is a business. And that autopsy laid out that over the last 2 years, last cycle, the Democratic apparatus, from the presidential campaign to the congressional committees and the senatorial committees, all of these committees that run these elections spend about $8 billion in total across the entire ecosystem. Let me say that again. They spend $8 billion. Okay. Target just recently lost 12. Okay. Like that, the party spends $8 billion. That's just in a 2-year period. And of that $8 billion, about 1% of that, approximately 1% of that is invested in Black communities. And what I mean by invested
1%. I just want to double click on that.
Yes, 1%. That's worth repeating. 1% is invested, and that's across all the races, not just the presidential, that's the Senate races, the congressional races, all these races where we try to turn out Black voters. They spend $8 billion and we get 1% of that, approximately 1% of that is invested back into mobilizing, turning out, and appealing to Black voters. Now, that is incredibly an appalling number. And so what I argue is that the autopsy also talks about how that $8 billion was spent, especially during the presidential campaign. And the point they make is that the money was invested in ways that line people's pockets not to win the election. Line people's pockets not to win the election. So $8 billion was spent little on Black people and mostly to line people's pockets. And so for me, I could not stand by silently and connect these two dots, which is one, investment influences outcomes. Here's the outcomes that matter, or the consequence, I should say, of those decisions that people that ran these elections made. So the party doesn't invest in us. The whole thing rides on our back, but we suffer the consequence of their actions. 7.5% unemployment, 400,000 Black people out of a job, Voting Rights Act abolished, practically demolished. I wouldn't say abolished, demolished. We suffer the consequence of those decisions that were made, the decisions to line people's pockets and not win the election. The people who walked away with all of that money, they're going to be fine. People like me and you, I'm not so sure what's going to happen to us. The other consequence of not investing in Black communities is now we're seeing a double digits of Black men voting for Trump. I mean, they're essentially saying there is no difference between the Democratic Party and Donald Trump, who's an all-out racist. That's a problem. So we've been bleeding support and waning erosion of support among Black voters since 2012. So there's a direct correlation between where we're spending our money and how that money or that lack of investment is affecting Black people. So I go so far. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I go so far as to say that what we should see is that $8 billion, every dollar that's spent and invested in the Democratic Party is an opportunity to invest in the ground to build Black infrastructure and build Black power in all of these states. It is what we saw in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams invested in between time year round in going out and engaging Black voters in rural America. And now that state is actually a purple state. They're going to potentially flip that entire state. So that's the crust of my argument. So I argue that we need to make demands. This party runs on our back. We need to demand that it's equitable. We need to demand that we share in the power of the party in these decisions. And I also suggest that we've got enough money and resources to do what the Democratic Party is not doing, and that is to invest in what I call an innovation lab to really unpack where Black voters are and create a Black agenda and a new playbook for engaging Black voters. So that's the crux of the op-ed.
Thank you for really, taking the time to lay that out. One of the things that I especially liked about what you said is, look, we don't have to sit around and wait for the Democratic Party to quote unquote do the right thing. There are plenty of outside groups that are prepared to be able to fully fund the things that they want. And so for our audience, for Black and Latino progressive leaning folks that are listening to this on the drive home or in their kitchen, what do you say to the person who feels like they've been the most loyal part of this coalition and the least served?
Well, I would say that your feelings are accurate. I mean, that's what was laid out in the autopsy. It's not a secret. You can go there and you can read it and you can put these two pieces together yourself. So your feelings are accurate. Now, the question is, what are we going to do about those feelings? And that's why I make the point that, let me take a step back. I also talk about this in my op-ed that the Congressional Black Caucus sent a letter out to corporations asking them about their DEI practices. And my point to the Congressional Black Caucus is that same letter should have gone to the Democratic Committee, the Democratic Party, because what we've seen in their autopsy is that they're not equitable. If Target fails, I can go out and get my toilet paper from anywhere. Amazon, pick it, choose it, Walmart, I can go anywhere else. But when the Democratic Party fails, then I lose my voting rights. Then I lose my job. Then we have record unemployment outside of a recession. That's a problem. And each one of us has individual power, but collectively, especially when we leverage our moral authority in this nation and within the Democratic Party, we have the ability to change and transform this system, because it is a system that really is no different than the system that the CBC is suggesting exists within these corporations that locks out Black people. That is the same case with the Democratic Party. And so what I would say is read the op-ed, write into Congressional Black Caucus members, write into the Democratic Party, and demand that the system be dismantled and that it be equitable. That we find a way to make sure that we're investing in Black infrastructure at the same rate that we're giving to this party. Recently I saw, the quiet thing was said out loud in the Houston Chronicle. Black woman was being interviewed and she said, we give 92% to this party and we get nothing in return. We've got to start getting something back in return. Yeah. And at a minimum, it has to be investment in building Black political power and infrastructure on the ground.
Well, listen, this is a message for a lot of folks. I mean, so whether we're talking about the Democratic Party itself, leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus, leadership of the Democratic Caucus, and also to donor activists out there. And so, Ashley, I feel like this conversation could go on for another hour, and so we're going to have you back.
Please do,
because there's even more. There's even more to dig into here, especially as we get closer and closer and closer to November and beyond.
Absolutely. So have me on, because this is going to be an ever evolving fight. It's not going to be an easy one to sort of, require that this party pays us like it owes us. So, but thank you for covering it, and I'll be back on whenever you need me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. When we come forward, we're switching gears. We'll be joined by California State Assembly member Mike Gibson, who is dealing with a profound grief. But we are remembering the bravery and the decency of incredible brother who lost his life in Compton over the weekend. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. More when we come forward.